Okay, we are going to get started here. Again, with what RIAs need to know about cybersecurity in 2023. There is no other resource that I know of that has as much information on the upcoming cybersecurity rule for RIAs than this. First, to get started, there's a little series of buttons on the bottom of your screen. You can use the Q&A button to ask us questions during the webinar. And will you do me a favor and just click on that Q&A icon and make sure that it comes up? And so being in tech, I know that these things always can go sideways and always at the worst possible time. If you can hear me, will you just please type "I can hear you" in the little area where there's a spot to type a question? Awesome, great. Thank you. One more request. If you can see a little kitten on the screen, will you type "I can see you"? Awesome. Thank you so much. Finally, you're going to want to grab a pencil or something to write with. There's a lot we are going to go over, and you will want to be able to refer to some of it later. All right, so who am I? Basically, why listen to me? Jonathan Addington. I'm the president of JM Addington Technology Solutions and Cybersecure RIA. I've been in technology since 2004, although I started getting paid for it in 7th grade. I began JM Addington Technology Solutions in 2010, and as we became more and more focused on cybersecurity and RIAs, we formed Cybersecure RIA specifically to secure advisors, and cybersecurity has been our focus since the very beginning. And today we've got a full staff to support RIAs across everything that you need, which also includes working side by side with existing IT providers or internal IT staff if you need help with the cybersecurity, but you've got some of the basic IT covered. So again, why listen to me? I'm already a recognized expert in this industry, brought on by other advisors on their podcasts, and even interviewed for publications such as Financial Advisor IQ. And I literally wrote the book on the SEC Cybersecurity rule. So here's some of the things that we're going to go over today. We're going to go over why the rule exists. We're going to talk about why the SEC created the cybersecurity rule. We'll go over the new reporting and disclosure requirements, especially the public-facing disclosures. We're going to hit on the existing laws and regulations that the SEC can use to enforce the rule right now. We're going to go over the importance of employee training, vendor due diligence, policies, procedures, and technical controls, and then finally, the difference between compliance and security. Let's get to the first section, the why. The why is really important because it explains the reasons behind the rule, the reasons the SEC is going to enforce it today, maybe even before October, and its importance to fiduciary duty. So one of the first things the SEC lays out in the rule is how bad cybersecurity attacks are today. And at their public meeting in July, they even opened up with, they've seen a 600% increase in attacks recently. And so that's just to say cyber attacks are going up everywhere exponentially. Predictions are that it will cost the global economy $10.5 trillion by 2025. And every 11 seconds, there's a new ransomware attack. So to put $10.5 trillion in perspective, that's over $14 million per minute. It's about half of the US GDP, about 4 times the entire GDP of England. The next thing is that there are a lot of rules that cover this cybersecurity ground already. But the existing regulations, they're unclear, they're overlapping. The SEC has enforced regulations under Gramm-Leach-Beachley and the Investment Advisors Act, along with other guidance and regulations. But the environment has changed significantly, and today it makes a lot of sense to condense all of these regulations into a single rule. And the good news is this is perhaps the clearest government regulation I've seen on cybersecurity. And from that perspective, it's really helpful. It's a nice cross of prescriptive and descriptive controls. Most of the government regulations boil down to be secure, and they don't tell you what their expectations actually are. And so from this perspective, it protects you because you can objectively say that you are doing the things the SEC wants you to do. When I speak on this, however, one of the most common objections I hear is it's proposed. Let's dig into that a little bit. So first, the SEC has it on their October agenda to finalize, and there's no reason to expect it won't be finalized. A similar version of this rule was finalized in July for public companies. And there is another rule they've put out that targets broker-dealers, exchanges, and other entities the SEC regulates. And so the SEC is clearly going after everyone under their regulatory authority right now for cybersecurity. And as you go through the rule and look at the rules that are out there, they really clearly believe that they already have the power to enforce what's in this rule. Last month, they very specifically replied to the objections that they don't have the authority to create these rules. And they said that we already have that statutory authority. These are some of the footnotes, some of the rules and regulations that the SEC name checks in their proposed rule for RIAs that cover this ground, that cover this area where they say, all right, we already have the authority for this. And along those lines, in July's public meeting, they said, all right, this is really a continuance of earlier rules and regulations, and it's not an overall replacement. So the implicit argument here is that they had the authority before and it wasn't contested, and they still have the authority now. You can go back to 2011 and look at the Investment Advisors Compliance Guide, and it explains why you should already cover some of this in your code of ethics. It looks different in implementation, but it's really the same concept 12 years later. And the author sees this as part of fiduciary obligation. And remember, this is back in 2011. And yet, this is the same thing the SEC says in 2023. They base their overall authority for the rule under the idea of fiduciary duty. And you, of course, already know what it means to be a fiduciary, and also that it goes well beyond just ethical and monetary concerns. It includes keeping information confidential, backup and disaster recovery plans, proper administrative and technology controls, and so much more. So the message the SEC wants you to hear, they can enforce this today. This is the bar. This is the standards that the SEC will hold you to, even if the rule is not finalized. We're already seeing these standards show up in recent audits. They clearly have an interest in cybersecurity. The second most common thing I hear from RIAs is we'll have time to implement this, and they typically think they'll have 18 to 24 months. Let's dig into that a little bit. This is a huge maybe. Again, to look at the July rule and the public meeting, this is really coming fast. For public companies, disclosures kick in at the end of 2023, this year. It's my opinion that we're going to see the SEC pushing for fast implementation on the RIA cybersecurity rule once it's finalized in October. So you're looking at possibly Q1 of 2024 for the first implementation of it being required. And let's move on to disclosures in the rule, which is likely the part that will be required first. So first, there's changes to the ADV Part 2 form. The SEC wants to know when you've been attacked. Some of this information is going to be confidential, and some of it will not be. Then there will be changes to the customer relationship summary, and obviously this part is not confidential. Everyone on this webinar today has a link to the CRS at the bottom of their webpage. And can you imagine adding a new section that lists every successful cybersecurity attack against your firm in the last 5 years? That is what's being proposed. And there are changes to a bunch of other forms. We're not going to go over all of these. Some of these may apply to you, some of them will not. The other issue here that's going to be really important is that the disclosure forms, they're not harmonized. So that means it's possible you will have multiple deadlines to file multiple different forms, possibly to different agencies, possibly to state agencies that aren't necessarily over financial entities specifically. And in some cases, you may even have more than one form, more than one disclosure to file with the SEC, and often on different timelines. Under the proposed rule, you're going to have 48 hours to notify the SEC that there's an attack underway. You'll have 48 hours to notify your clients that there's an attack underway. And you will have to disclose previous incidents to prospective clients, which also means you will effectively be disclosing any cyber attacks against your firm to your competitors as well. 48 hours isn't a lot of time in this world. You may not yet know, is this an attack or is it an anomaly? You don't know if it's material. You often don't know what the impact is going to be. So you really need to make sure that you are prepared ahead of time for an attack. You need to know who to call. You should have a lawyer who specializes in cybersecurity incidents on speed dial. You should have a template ready to communicate with the SEC that doesn't use words like breach or data loss. And you need to have a pre-game strategy on what and how you communicate this to your clients and the outside world. And this was best practice for businesses and advisors already, but now it's become twice as important. Now, we do have an update, again, based on July's rule. The finalized rule in July gave public companies 96 hours to file updates with the SEC, and we can only hope that they'll go the same way with advisors. It's still a fast deadline, but it is helpful to give you that additional time to clarify what the scope of the attack is and give you more time to actually respond and mitigate the attack before you have to go and start filing the paperwork. Let's take a look at employee education. And of course, training is already required for all areas of compliance for advisors. This is the cybersecurity portion, and we're going to look at a little bit of why it's important and what's changed. You know, today, 3/4 of breaches have a human element. So that means nearly every attack, successful attack against you, is going to have something to do with a human inside your firm. And in a change from older trends where phishing always topped the list of ways hackers got into systems, stolen credentials are now on top. This doesn't mean that phishing isn't important, but it does mean that password hygiene has gone from, like, you know, we're doing it because we have to you're doing it because you have to. It's important. You're also going to make sure that you tailor the training to the roles. Your partners and your CEO will get different training than your administrative staff. Now, this is probably different than the way you do training today. So make sure that you stop and think about this, that you're not just giving the same blanket training for everybody in your firm. And as mentioned, of course, phishing simulation is still it's a must-have for an effective cybersecurity education program. This is an example of phishing training. It's an automated email that tests your employees on a regular basis. If they click on a link, it shows up on a report so they can take remedial training, and so you can document that training. To give you an idea of how quickly this landscape is changing, this is an actual phishing email that hit my inbox recently. This very legitimate looking invoice uses a phone number to vish me. It wants me to call the number. And because this PDF isn't malicious, it's going to get by most spam filters. They want me to call so they can defraud me over the phone. And this is a type of phishing attack and a type of fraud that very few companies protect or train against. And this means that the training has to be regular. You need to update it with current threats. Top RIA consultants are reading the rules as requiring quarterly training, and of course you're going to do some level of annual training as well. Let's take a look at vendor due diligence. So I know I'm moving fast. I'm trying to respect your time here. Vendor due diligence has long been a part of cybersecurity frameworks, but it is relatively new to RIA regulations. You could sum up this portion of the rule by saying your vendors must supply cybersecurity standards that live up to the security the SEC expects of you. You cannot have your vendors be the weak link in your cybersecurity chain. So you'll start by identifying vendors that have access to your data or your client's information. And this is a sample list of companies or industries that you might need to conduct due diligence on. Not all of these will apply to you, but you can see that it goes a lot beyond what you might think of at the beginning. There's a lot of people that have access to your confidential information, to non-public information about your clients. So after identifying those vendors that have data or may present a risk, you're going to assess what that level of risk is. And then finally, you're going to ask your vendors or find public documentation on how do they protect themselves and their clients from cybersecurity risk. For example, do they encrypt their data? How do they encrypt their data? Do they have access controls in place? Do they have a written, comprehensive cybersecurity program? This is all information that you should gather or reconfirm annually. And these are all documents that you should have in place that are easily accessible by an auditor. It will make your life so much easier. We're going to take a look at technical policies and procedures here. And we're going to put these together. They're not technically the same. There's not 100% overlap, but in general, the technical controls exist to enforce written policies and procedures. And that's because you should have most of these controls in place from the administrative point of view. The technical controls are to ensure that you're compliant, or in other words, the technical controls exist to make sure you do what you said you were going to do. And in the past, your paperwork could more or less say, we're going to stay secure, and if you checked off a few of those boxes, you were compliant. Today, there are specific types of controls that you ought to have in place. And we're going to look at them by type today instead of the tactical level implementation. First step is identity and access management, IAM. This is the need to know principle. And of course, this isn't new. Advisors were never allowed to let people access client information that they didn't need to. Your technical side of it, though, is a lot different today. Your systems need to ensure that people that do not need access to client information cannot have access to it. For example, your receptionist should not have a lot of information on clients like their portfolios or trades, and vendors should not have more access to information than they need to do their jobs. Your code of ethics should already cover who has access to what and limit access to that confidential information to those that need to know it. And this can be a far-reaching part of the rule. For example, if your advisors have individual books of business, they should not be allowed to see data on each other's clients except to the extent that they need to, maybe to cover for each other. And part of this is you need to log who accessed what and when they accessed it. And you ought to have a system that checks those logs to ensure that only authorized persons access confidential information and that the system throws an alert if there was suspicious activities. And this is so much harder than it was before because there's so many more places that you keep your data, and it's so much easier to share today than it ever was. Logging is easy, but it generates so much information, it's hard to comb through those logs to look for abnormalities. This is what it looks like from my side of the table. There's still one needle, but now there's 10 stacks of hay to look through. And so the bottom line is you need to have technology that enforces this for a broad range of applications. You need to log and audit all of it, and you can't do it by hand. You need tools. So we're going to roll into our next portion, mobile device management, abbreviated as MDM. MDM is for all of your mobile devices. That's iPhones, iPads, laptops, Androids, anything else that doesn't stay at the office. And again, this enforces the administrative controls you already have written down. For example, your policy should already say something like, you're not allowed to access data remotely unless it's from a secure location. So your technical control will be, you can't access client data from insecure Wi-Fi or other public networks like a hotel Wi-Fi. Starbucks isn't secure. Even in-flight Wi-Fi isn't secure. This is from my last Delta flight, and you can see that there's no encryption here on their in-flight Wi-Fi. Other things that MDM commonly goes over, your MDM should force users to have passcodes on their phones, encryption, and the ability to remotely wipe a device if it's lost, stolen, or left in your Uber. And I can tell you, from working with clients personally, this is not hypothetical. This is real life. And of course, you need to document that you were doing all of these things and that those policies were in place. So real quick, let's do have you ever. Have you ever used a non-work approved cell phone to look up a client's portfolio or trades? Or ever given a child the device to watch TikTok or YouTube so you can have an adult conversation? Or have you ever borrowed your spouse's phone real quick during vacation just to look something up? And even if you're perfect, all right, you're the kid that got a 4.1 GPA, A++, you've never done any one of these things. How would you prove that? The answer is, did you document it? Did you document that you have controls in place that didn't allow for these types of things? Now, of course, there are real emergencies. Sometimes things literally catch on fire or you deal with a natural disaster. But your MDM should ensure that access during those emergencies are exceptions, they're not the rule, and that you log when these sort of emergencies or abnormal connections to data pop up. Let's take a look at updating software. This connects back to MDM because if your software on your mobile device isn't up to date, then you can't access data securely. You can't say that we are properly protecting client information and firm information. And before your eyes glaze over and you say, we've got this covered, everything needs to be kept up to date. And every single time we audit an environment, we find something that's out of date. Even when external broker-dealers are providing security, we find things that are out of date. And there's just so much to keep up with today. And of course, you need to be able to log that software was updated, or at least that you had policies and controls in place that show that these updates happen automatically. In other words, you're going to have a record that you did what you said you were going to do for when the SEC audits you. Let's take a look at vulnerability management. You can see how these things are starting to fit together. You need to have all of them to have a complete and balanced, comprehensive cybersecurity strategy. Now, the vulnerability management program, this is where you're going to actively look for places your systems are weak. It's an ongoing process, which of course, at a minimum means that they are updated, right? Our previous section. This is typically an automated and a manual process. There's a lot of things that can be tested with software, but some of them can't be. And you are going to document all of your findings, and you're going to document your plans to mitigate those. And we're going to come back to that. Some of that fits into another section. All right, we're running a little bit short on time here, but let's get to data loss prevention, DLP. And so a good DLP plan requires that you already have these elements in place we've covered: IAM, MDM, vulnerability management. I know this sounds really obvious, but DLP is don't let non-public data leave your systems. And if it does leave them, you need to throw up some red flags that it did. And it isn't easy. This one really requires a detailed and technical implementation. This is just an example of a DLP program and how it fits into data governance, risk management, vendor due diligence, and data protection. This is what DLP looks like inside of Microsoft. And this isn't to scare you or to say you've got to go and implement it like this today, but it is to give you an idea of how much is involved in DLP. And if I showed you how DLP looked in other platforms, it would look very similar. And so, of course, under existing rules, you already aren't supposed to let this information leave your network, but this is the technical way to enforce it, to block it, and detect and report it. So some examples for DLP policies: your USB drive should be turned off. Your emails should be scanned for confidential information as they leave your network. So if you see social security numbers, banking numbers, etc., the system should be detecting those and block them from being sent. In most cloud systems, they let you share data so easily. You need to limit that or turn it off. And you can't skimp on this part of it. Even if you're the IT person and you think you've got it under control, it's so easy to set up cloud sharing applications as a non-IT person that most firms have way more file sharing apps than they're aware of. Or the last guy set it up, didn't lock it down, and you thought that they did. Now, Apple, Microsoft, and Google will all save files to the cloud by default. So it's very possible you've already put client data on the cloud without realizing it. And this is where technical controls and policies play such an important role to make sure that that cannot happen. And just like you scan your email, your firewall should be scanning your outgoing network traffic. It should be looking for traffic to or from unauthorized countries, to or from unauthorized cloud sharing applications, or at least see if these cloud sharing applications exist on your phones or computers. And again, you're going to log as much of it as you can. If you can log all of the data access, that's preferred, but at least document the things that you have in place. All right, so let's look at security versus compliance. So security is where you actually keep things secure, and compliance is where you document that you did it, that you did all the things you said you were going to do. You can think of it like this, where you've got security on the left. It includes things like IAM, MDM, software updates, vulnerability management. And then you've got that documentation on the right, which includes things like policies and procedures, regular reviews, documentation on training, that sort of thing. And where those two meet is where you have compliance. And it doesn't mean that it's perfection. This is an important point. And it doesn't mean that you're never going to have an incident. I can almost guarantee you that at some point you will have an incident. And it's not just filling out paperwork. Like we saw, it's the crossroads of security and documentation. And you don't need to fix everything. You do need to document the things that you're going to fix. No one can make their environment 100% secure, but you need to document what your plans are to fix the weaknesses. Or sometimes it isn't worth fixing. You need to document it. Sometimes you can't fix it, or you've got bigger fish to fry. Maybe there's a vendor that needs to fix it and they haven't yet. And larger firms are going to be held to a higher standard than smaller firms. And sometimes there's just more important things to work on, and that's fine. But make sure you write it down and follow the plan, because the worst thing you can do is to say that you're going to do it and then not do it. All right, so let's take a look at risk assessments. This isn't the same thing as your vulnerability program. The vulnerability program is working constantly to keep things safe. A cybersecurity assessment is a snapshot at a specific point in time. It's going to record what you're doing, what you're not doing. It's kind of like an internal security audit, because your business risk is client risk. And if your business is compromised to the point that you can't function adequately, you've breached your fiduciary duty. The good news is this doesn't have to be hard, especially after you've done it for the first time. It's the first step of your cybersecurity program, and it's the last step, because this is where you audit and test the security of your environment on a scheduled basis. You're going to take the findings, you're going to document them, you're going to update your vulnerability management program. You're going to document what you're going to do to fix things. You're going to document what you did to fix them. And then you're going to run another assessment to show that you've made these changes that successfully closed the gaps between where you were at one risk assessment and where you are today. And so this is where you have the live test on your cybersecurity and where you can start your cybersecurity journey today, where you can start your documentation and you can start your compliance. It's the proof that you started. All right, so what else? I mean, of course, there's more. It's a 200-page rule, but this is the fundamentals of the rule and the primary things that the SEC outlines. What's your next step? Get a free cybersecurity assessment from us. We're not going to ask for your passwords. You can involve your current IT company if you want. We're not going to remove any data. And what's the catch? There's no catch. I want to help you on your cybersecurity journey. I strongly believe that everybody deserves to be secure. That includes you. It includes your clients. It includes American businesses at large. And this is obviously one of the most important things for RIAs today. And so you can get that free cybersecurity assessment on us. This is the same assessment that we do for our clients and that we run against ourselves. And it's one of the most valuable offers I can make to you today. And if you feel like it's too soon, then go download our ebook for RIAs. You can see the address on your screen here. That's ria.tips/RIA-ebook. And before we get to questions, will you do me one last favor? And just in that Q&A section, put a 1 through a 10 in there and let me know how helpful this was for you. And if there's anything else that you would like to see covered in a future webinar, please go ahead and let me know, and I'll be sure to get it in there. Thanks for attending. Be sure to take that next step today. Don't go away with a head full of knowledge and an empty action plan. I'll stick around for a few minutes here for any questions. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. If you do have a question, you can feel free to put it into the Q&A, the chat, or raise your hand in Zoom. Yeah, are there updates between the 2022 rule and the 2023 revision? If you don't know, the SEC put out the first version of the rule in 2022, and they put out a revised version this year. Basically, no, there's not significant differences between those two. And other than what we've seen come out for the rule for public companies, we don't expect any significant differences. Implementation time. Again, there's a wait and see to this. Originally, I was kind of on the side that it might be 18 months, especially speaking to other consultants. Seeing what the SEC did for the rule on public companies has made me rethink that. I think it's really likely that we'll see mandatory disclosures come in earlier. Yeah, documentation. There's kind of a lot to go over there. If you want to see an example of what we have available for documentation for RIAs, just do me a favor and email info@cybersecurity.com. Now, that documentation should include things like device inventory, documentation on training, documentation on updates and patches, and that's going to be for every piece of software on your computer. And most tools today will only cover a dozen, 20 pieces of software, something like that. Our tool covers hundreds of pieces. You're going to want to cover that you had things up to date, that you had that program in place, that you had training in place, what the training was, that you were conducting phishing simulation. I think it's really important that you're running dark web scans to see what credentials are on the dark web. You know, we saw on that slide earlier, and this was from the most recent report available, that stolen credentials are one of the top way hackers get in today. Again, that's different. Until recently, it was phishing. So that's an example of the type of documentation. You're really going to want to have updates every 90 days, and this isn't just me. It's me talking with one of the top RIA consultants in the industry to make sure that our program meets all of your needs. And then having some sort of annual assessment is going to be a must. And yeah, no, it's not just that external assessment. You might have had an external pen test done before. Again, in my opinion, those are close to useless today. Unless you're running an internal server, you've got most of your data in the cloud. And so that data is accessible either by compromising one of your workstations or compromising your Microsoft 365 or Dropbox or other cloud accounts like that. And so you really need to have an assessment that covers those things and not just like an external test that says, yeah, there's nothing that's open on our firewall, because almost nobody has that anymore. All right, that's all the time we've got. Thanks for attending. Again, if you've got questions, you can email those to info@cybersecure.ria or contact us for an assessment and we'll get you scheduled. Enjoy the rest of your day.